Good morning. I'm so glad you're with us this morning, whether you're here physically or online. Hello, online. We're less without you, and I hope you believe me whenever I say that. I'm Blair, the children's pastor here at Watershed, and I love when I get to join you in the big room. There's an energy and a gratitude and a deeper understanding for me that stems from me experiencing our interconnectedness. Nothing we do in the hallway does not affect you in this room. And nothing you do in this room does not affect the little people that give life to that hallway. Speaking of our interconnectedness, I want to give you a glimpse of Blair more than 3 decades ago. I grew up on a farm, and I had 2 main goals in life. Number 1 was that I would go from riding on the tractor to driving the tractor, which did not end well. I ended up in a ditch one day, never drove the tractor again. Pretty sure I was not the best. The second goal was that I got to sit in the middle seat of the truck whenever we rode around the farm because my granddad would push the clutch and let us change the gears. And it was the most exciting thing for me ever. Those are the 2 goals I had that meant that I had arrived. But I want to tell you this morning about a time that my sister and I were playing outside, which was very typical for us. We played in the fresh dirt anytime it was there. We played hide and seek in the fields. It was very rare that we were inside watching TV, extremely. And if the TV was on in our house, it was either the weather, Carolina basketball, or Braves baseball. Those were the 3 things. I didn't realize it at the time, but I had the honor of learning a lot from my granddad while we rode around. He became the breadwinner of his house at the age of 12. Then married my grandmother. They had 5 kids. And then they successfully farmed their land for years and years with the help of their kids, their grandkids, which was me, and then some immigrants that traveled from Mexico that hung out with us every summer. And they eventually felt more like family than the help. I never forget those lessons. I learned about crop rotation. I learned about the field resting, the importance of what happens when farmers don't take care of their land. But I'm also grateful that our parents let us wander and experience things on our own. So at the ripe old age of 6, I thought my sister hung the moon, and she talked me into testing to see if we were allergic to poison ivy. I was like, okay. But instead of testing one spot, we rubbed it all over our bodies, everywhere. What seemed like such a brave and smart idea at the time left us in bed scratching for days, taking multiple baths, rubbing bottles of calamine lotion all over us. We were basically just pink walking around the house. You name it, and we did it, whatever we could do to stop itching. It was miserable enough that I still remember it 30 years later. Wild recollection, right? Honestly, leaves of 3, let them be, isn't all that I learned that day. This moment was pivotal for me. This was the moment the earth reminded me of its power, of my humanity, and the equality that we share. And if we're honest, this reminding has been happening for years. In ancient times, they honored the earth. They saw it as a part of not only their individual identity, but their collective self. Lots of developments in the Western world led to the separation of humans and non-humans. Values shifted that led to the foundations of anthropocentrism, which is a framework of beliefs that declares humans as superior to the non-human world. In the early 17th century, René Descartes, the father of modern philosophy, framed the world as essentially split between the realm of mind and that of matter. Descartes saw humans as superior to nature and non-human animals who he considered mere mindless machines to be mastered and exploited. Whew. If there was ever a time to make some connections. Matt talked about this more last week, so if you missed it, you can always go back and check that out. But this morning, I want us to go back to the beginning of Judaism and Christianity, the time when the world started to shift towards the ego trip of humanity being more valuable than any other part of creation. I want us to look deeper into what our ancestors tried to teach us about how the earth, how nature reveals the sacred. In Leviticus, the third book of the Old Testament, it's probably the weirdest book of the Bible. Not many people use it, but it's here that we can learn about justice, caring for the poor, and living with intention. It's here that we learn for the first time about being good stewards of creation. And those things that they dealt with then are the exact same things we're dealing with now. This book is about hope when the community structure goes sideways. It's about a world with a healthy respect for life and creation. This account starts with sacrifices, slaughtering, spreading blood all over an altar, just a normal Tuesday. Then we move to this whole chapter on you are what you eat, and then something about a man's discharge. And then finally, we get to discussing the land, or black gold, as some farmers call it. So in Leviticus 25, the Lord said to Moses at Mount Sinai, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I'm going to give you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years sow your fields, and for 6 years prune your vineyards and gather their crops. But in the 7th year, the land is to have a year of Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. Do not sow your fields or prune your vineyards. Do not reap what grows of itself or harvest the grapes of your untended vines. The land is to have a year of rest. Count off 7 Sabbath years, 7 times 7 years, so that the 7 Sabbath years amount to a period of 49 years. Consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each of you is to return to your family property and to your own clan. If you sell land to any of your own people or buy land from them, do not take advantage of each other. You are to buy from your own people on the basis of the number of years since the Jubilee, and they are to sell to you on the basis of the number of years left for harvesting crops. When the years are many, you are to increase the price, and when the years are few, you are to decrease the price, because what you are really being sold is the number of crops. Do not take advantage of each other. If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and are unable to support themselves among you, help them as you would a foreigner and stranger, so they can continue to live among you. Do not take interest or any profit from them, but fear your God, so that they may continue to live among you. You must not lend them money at interest or sell them food at a profit. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and be your God. If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to you, do not make them work as slaves. They are to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you. They are to work for you until the year of Jubilee. Then they and their children are to be released, and they will go back to their own clans and to the property of their ancestors. Because the Israelites are my servants whom I brought out of Egypt, they must not be sold as slaves. Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God. At the beginning of this passage, we read that we should let the land rest. Ancient Jews knew the importance of this, so they created a law called the Shemitah. We see this idea in multiple places in the Hebrew Bible. It's a law that enforces a sabbatical year. In Exodus, it says, "Let the land rest and lie fallow." So what is fallowing? I'm so glad you asked. Fallowing the soil is not planting anything in it for at least one season. It causes the potassium and the phosphorus from deep below to rise towards the soil surface so it can be used by crops later. It also raises the levels of carbon and nitrogen and organic matter. It improves the moisture holding capacity, and it increases the beneficial microorganisms that live in that soil. This process was important during ancient times because it also would rid the soil of any pest that had come during using it. This year of resting also created a time of rest for the family that tended the soil, because if there's nothing planted, there's nothing to prune, to weed, or to gather. And you're probably thinking, what did they do for food? Did they just starve? No. This is why the Shemitah was in place. It mandated that these communities of farmers took care of each other. And not in like a they are less fortunate, so let's give them our scraps or hand-me-downs kind of way, but in a way that was respectful and fair. The Shemitah protected farmers against those farmers who had their eye on becoming wealthy through buying others' land. Isn't that funny? We often romanticize this communal focus in Scripture when the reality is that they had to enforce laws to make sure that that was happening, to make sure that the few did not take over the masses. They had to be reminded that we all, humanity and non-humanity, belong to each other. So the Shemitah not only enforced rest, but it also made sure the land's richness could not be derailed by the incompetence of some or the greed of others. Farmers who did well were not to make the basis of helping for enlarging their farms. They were there to make sure that the land stayed the way it was supposed to. Taking over land was temporary and fair if it was necessary. And like I said, it was all for the goal of doing what was best for the land. So I want to focus on two things here. This need for always wanting more, and what we give up to get there. The need for more has always been there. And this is some sort of ego trip that we take, where we think that maybe we're more valuable than the rest of creation, or maybe we don't need rest. But we have disrupted the rhythms of rest. We have disrupted the rhythms of the land. If you were to ask me how I define sin, I would answer selfishness. To me, it is the root of everything we consider to be harmful in our society. I'm sure some of you could probably poke holes in that, but that's just something that is really hard for me. We constantly live in this scarcity mindset, this individualistic place where we are so worried about ourselves, having money stored away just in case something happens, sending our kids to college one day, and so on and so on and so on. We have taken advantage of the soil. We have substituted rest with fertilizers and pesticides so that productivity never stops. And here's the thing. We're just like the soil. We have substituted rest with coffee and busyness and the so-called American dream. The land is teaching us the sacredness of rest and rhythms, the sacredness of caring for each other, and we continue to ignore it. There's a rhythm that's built into creation, into the soil, a rhythm my body and your bodies want. And if we don't honor those rhythms, things start to unravel. But just like human activity has led to soil degradation, and I don't know if you know this, but there are some parts in U.S. where they've tested soil and it's exactly the same as Mars. That's how much we've degraded the soil in certain places. Just like we have degraded the soil, we as people are no different. Lack of rhythms and rest have led to a collective burnout. The way we see everything has been affected. Our relational output to the world is struggling. Why? Because our world values productivity above all else. Ladies and gentlemen, going off the grid is hard, especially when no one else is doing it. Some of us might feel guilty whenever we go off the grid. Some feel competitive and like you're going to miss out and somebody's going to get ahead of you. At the beginning of this pandemic, you know, the days whenever we thought it was going to last for 2 weeks and then be over, there was a wave of relief across social media. I remember reading people's posts like 3 days in. They were like, this is nice that we're not running around and we don't have sports to take our kids to and we can all sit down and eat together. There's like this special time of just being. Of course, there was uncertainty and anxiety about that. But for the most part, it was this collective breath that everybody took. But at day 15, chaos ensued. When people realized it wasn't going to last only 2 weeks, families went crazy looking for quarantines and nannies. The corporate world shifted to creating systems and spaces for working from home. Anxiety went through the roof for those who had to go to their job. Fear of not having enough money or toilet paper or groceries took over. It was so much easier when we rested together. Rest for us and the earth helps us to refresh, to let the good parts in ourselves rise to the surface and take over. It helps us to remember that we are no more important than any other part of creation. Life still continues when we stop. The world doesn't need us. When we violate the natural rhythms that our bodies and hearts and mind require, despair, lack of meaning in life, and existential angst all creep in. Interestingly enough, there's a consensus among scholars that the Israelite people didn't actually observe the Shemitah laws. You know, God's chosen people think they know more than others, have focus on themselves instead of the collective whole. Sounds familiar, right? There's no evidence that they took a break every 6 years. It is believed that they ignored the wisdom of their ancestors. And if you flip a few pages in the Bible, you realize that later, these former Hebrew slaves settle in the land of Israel. They build a nice little kingdom in Jerusalem, and then the Babylonians come. Their rulers become corrupt. They exploit the poor. The gap between the rich and the poor widens. These books of the Bible, the minor prophets and the Hebrew prophets, are the start of social justice. They rise up and speak against the system. They speak up and say that the powerful are exploiting the powerless. Some people are in palaces and some can't even scrape together enough for one meal. These prophets say that the whole thing is in trouble because when you ignore the least of these, the whole thing becomes vulnerable. And then the Babylonians came and conquered Jerusalem and hauled everybody away to exile in Babylon. And no different than today, when these things happen, everyone has their own take on what caused it. And one of the prophets blamed all of this on them not observing the Shemitah. Because when we don't give our bodies, minds, hearts souls and brains the rest that they require, the need to be restored and refreshed, then they can't give us what they want to give us. They start to break down. We then find ourselves disconnected from everything in life, and we find our communities as a whole in exile. Our natural instinct is to keep pushing because this is our drug. We are addicted. What are our rhythms? We beat ourselves up when we take breaks. We think someone else is going to get ahead or get what we want. Someone might pass us on the corporate ladder that we're trying to climb. We think we'll be punished for stopping. Maybe that's true in the world that we live in today. But I believe it's time for us to take intentional steps towards balance and rhythm. Our world has gone sideways. Let's confront a system that only knows how to move 100 miles per hour. And it's not easy. It's not going to be quick. It will take perseverance and action. But when I think about what makes the church different, this is it. Valuing people and our world over money, convenience, and commodity is what makes us different. Because this is what stops our egos from taking over. This is what moves us from individualistic to communal thinking. And that affects how we show up in this world, how you parent, how we work, how we partner. Without rest and acknowledging our interconnectedness, the powerful exploit the powerless. People believe that their business savviness makes them more important to our economy. Some convince themselves that they deserve more because they work harder. These things are leading to issues that affect us all. Transportation, food production, fashion, housing, education, all of these things are affected by this. I know farmers who will let their crops die because they get more money from a loss from the government than they would if they actually farmed the land. Some people own multiple houses, which lead to others owning none. I listened to an interview with Charlotte people just this week on NPR. First-time home buyers feel hopeless because the people with more money or more power come in and win every bid. And then, when people buy these houses for profit, instead of for these families to live in, then we end up having to build more houses, which cuts down more of our trees. So it's this cycle. Then there's education. Some people refuse to send their kids to their neighborhood schools. And this is the reason our schools are losing funding, support, and are not diverse. Public education is being starved on purpose. When they are forced to fail, then private schools get to come in and receive the public funding through vouchers. This is all intentional, and we are feeding right into it. And I know, I get why you make all of these decisions. But I'm asking you to stop and reflect with me. I'm asking you to think about the collective we instead of me. I'm asking you to think outside of your small worlds to a bigger picture. Our actions affect us all. And we are being selfish and reckless. This lack of rest, rhythm, has led to an individualism. And that individualism and desire to get ahead then leads to a lack of rest. It's a cycle, and we are figuratively killing each other. What can you do to create a rhythm? How can you turn off? How can you engage and disengage? How can you step towards health? Do you even acknowledge that your health impacts the world around you? How can you let the land lie fallow? I know this is hard. Parents, maybe you can find another parent to swap kids with so that both of you have alone time. Maybe we can intentionally choose time to turn our phones off, emails off, turn Slack off, social media. People who lead teams in your office, what can you do to celebrate times of rest for your employees? Maybe we take time to play together, to pretend like all the work is done, even when it's not. Have we demanded more of the soil, our mind, our body, than it can continue to give? Have we failed to rest and let it refresh? The answer is yes. We have forgotten that we all belong to each other. We have forgotten that we are all equal in value, human and inhuman. We have forgotten that if we believe in Jesus' ways, we're not here to dominate, but to bring peace. There's a reason Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey instead of a war horse. There's a reason Jesus put an ear back on a guard when someone loyal was just trying to protect him. We can't change the past, but we can make lifestyle changes that shift our trajectory. Will we honor the land? Will we honor our bodies and minds and hearts? Will we choose this beautiful thing called we instead of me?